We are the loneliest society there's ever been. There's a study that asks Americans, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer, is none. Half of all Americans asked how many people know you well, say nobody.
Good morning. This is week 2 of our series on loneliness. Week 1, last week, Pastor Paul and I shared this teaching time together to introduce the series. We met via Zoom the week before several times, and then on Friday in person to get ready together. I'm not always the sharpest tool in the shed, and so it took until about midway through our second meeting that it suddenly occurred to me how very beautiful it was to do a Sunday morning teach on loneliness, not by myself, but with another person. Getting ready for Sunday morning's teaches is generally a very solitary task. And well, frankly, it can be a little lonely. But last week when I co-taught with Pastor Paul, it was fun. He and I worked together on it, and it was wonderfully collaborative as we tossed ideas back and forth. And then at one point, we worked on a Google document together on different sections, and it was quiet for about 20 or 30 minutes as we each did our own thing, but we did it together. It felt like the idea that the importance of connecting wasn't just being talked about, we were actually doing it and experiencing it in the moment. Today, I'm here on my own. My name is Carolyn Klassen. I am an elder and a teacher here at TMP, and my day job is as a therapist. I'm speaking about the individual's response to loneliness. And it only makes sense for me to look at the individual person, knowing that Pastor Paul is going to be looking at the community, the collective responsibility of loneliness next week. A client calls me in the middle of the day, in between sessions. Carolyn, I'm scared. He reminds me that I told him to call me if his risk of self-harm was 8 out of 10 or higher, and he's there. I take a deep breath, and my voice is calm and slow, and I say, tell me more. He tells me about this and that, maybe not a big deal to some, but very painful things to someone who is already feeling like no one cares. He feels so isolated. I can hear how painful this is for him, and I can hear how he takes these experiences and uses them to feel further defeated. We talk for maybe 10 minutes. I don't talk him out of anything. I mostly just listen. I don't give him any ideas or advice. Then I ask him what his number is, and he's quiet for a minute while he checks in inside. He goes, 4. It's 4 out of 10. And it's like he's almost a little surprised. And now he takes a deep breath. I'll see you at our session next week, he says before he hangs up the phone. He's better. Not great, but better than he was. He wasn't alone. He was around me. Even through the phone, he was with someone whose heartbeat was about 60 beats a minute, normal blood pressure, not scared, just caring. Being around someone who believes in him and cares for him. He could borrow my nervous system to help soothe his. Us therapists, we call that co-regulation. I'm a grandma to the cutest little boy that you will ever meet, for sure. He's a toddler now, which means he toddles into things, falls down, and bumps his head pretty much every time I get a chance to see him. When he hurts himself, he bursts out crying, and you can guess what he does next. He looks around for his mom and reaches out his arms to her. He needs her. He needs her to regulate him. He co-regulates with her as she picks him up and she acknowledges how much it hurts. She gently rubs the bump and she rocks him. And as he starts to cry a little less and calm down, her rocking slows and her voice gets softer. Does she take away the pain? Well, she can't really stop him from the hurting because the bump is red and it is swelling even as we look at it. But he does stop crying and he starts playing again far sooner than if he was left alone to deal with his pain. She actually does pain relief just by being with him. She helps him through his pain in a way he couldn't get through on his own. And I'm not sure a whole lot changes for us as we get older, though we'd like to think otherwise. You and I both benefit from a loving person to get us through the pain that our life inevitably gives us. I raised my children by disciplining them with timeouts. When they got tantrumy and wouldn't listen and got disobedient, we parents were told to put them in their room by themselves so they could calm down, think about what they had done, and come out and make better choices. We punished them by withdrawing love and presence. At the time, we believed this was the right thing. It certainly seemed a better alternative than to spank or hit them into obedience. However, with a time out, what we are asking these little nervous systems to do is to figure out how to calm themselves at an age where developmentally they're not able to do that. Children need a grown-up nervous system to regulate off of. Really, we all calm down better when we are around someone else who is calm. Most of us get more dysregulated when we are cut off from other people. During a timeout, children are alone and isolated, which can further increase their panic and upset and their ability to calm themselves. What most children really need when they're dysregulated is time in. Time in with a calm adult that will help them re-regulate, help them get into a state where they can be less upset. And once they're regulated, that is when they can learn. And that is when they can learn about better choices. Time in is recognizing that you, as an adult caregiver, are essential to this child's ability to get back to a state of calm. As adults, we also need people we trust to be with, to hang around them, to experience life in community. Our nervous systems rely on other people's nervous systems when we get anxious or scared. Now, you don't have to like this or hate this. You just know that it's true. Several years ago, I listened to an interview with Maziar Bahari, and a journalist who was imprisoned in Iran. He says this: "Well, you know, I spent 107 days in solitary confinement, and sometimes when I tell people that, they ask me, 'And were you also tortured?' And that is like asking someone who has cancer, 'And do you have any other illnesses?' Solitary confinement is the worst kind of torture. Human beings are social animals. Human beings need to communicate. They need to be loved. They need to touch other people." Maziar goes on to describe the mental anguish that comes with solitary confinement. He talks about the physical sensations of isolation, the physical sensations of isolation, which are too intense to tolerate, and the thought distortions that creep up as a result of being completely alone. He contemplated suicide very seriously, but he didn't act on it. Why? Conversations with his dad. His father talked him out of it. He knew his dad. He'd had enough conversations, a lifetime of conversations with him in the real, that he could bring him to mind and continue those conversations in his imagination in solitary confinement. It was the deep connection he had with a loved one, his dad, that allowed him to stay alive. Some of you might say that a church can be one of the loneliest places to be. You feel pushed out, pushed away. You don't know where you belong, if you belong, or maybe you're even convinced you don't belong. If that's your story, please know that this breaks my heart. This is not okay. We have missed the mark, and we have failed you if that is your experience. It's not okay with Jesus either. If you scan the Gospels, you can read of how Jesus hangs out with the people that others push away and push out. He seeks to gather them in. He challenges those that are excluders to become includers. He invites his disciples to hang out with the people at the margins so that the margins actually disappear. He brings people back into community. And we're going to look at just one story like this in Mark 5. When Paul asked me to speak today, and he gave me the theme, and I read the text that he wanted me to use, I was thrilled, majorly, because he invited me to spend time with my very best friend in the whole Bible. And that probably sounds weird and maybe a little creepy, but it's not. You'll make sense of it in a while, because she and I spent a lot of time together while I was doing my grad studies. And by the end of it, it felt like we were buddies. She has actually whispered into my ear a fair bit over the years, and you'll understand why. In a lot of Bibles, this woman's story is told in the section that is entitled The Hemorrhaging Woman, sometimes the Sick Woman. I would just rather know her as God sees her, as courageous, brave, and full of faith. Matter of fact, that's my term of endearment for her, is faith. I don't know what her real name is, but I'm going to call her Faith this morning. So we're going to start in Mark 5, the second half of verse 24. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman who was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. So Faith may have had some sort of endometriosis or some sort of gynecology problems, we're not sure. But in any case, in the culture of that day, when women had their periods, they were considered unclean. Leviticus 15 talks about how she is unclean. Anything she touches unclean, and anybody who touches her or what she has touched, they become unclean. So the result is that she is ostracized, put in permanent time out, away from everybody, isolated, left to figure out how to deal with this awful, but to do it either completely on her own or with others, maybe a few others who were similarly excluded up in the hills. Verse 26, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. The original language is clear that she was so desperate to be healed that she turned to anybody who said they could make her better, and they were imposters. They were swindlers. She'd been manipulated and exploited. One more layer of isolation. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind the crowd and she touched his cloak. So in order to slip in and touch his robe, she had to come down from the isolated hills and be amongst the people. And this, folks, was completely inappropriate. She had the guts to break the rules, to reach out for her own healing. And I can't tell you how much I admire her for this. She had absolutely no business being anywhere in the crowd where she might touch any number of folks, never mind with a focus to touch Jesus. Verse 28, she says, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. This woman has faith. She believes that he can heal her. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. She was healed. At once, Jesus realized the power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding around you," his disciples answered, "and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" So clearly, if others find out that she has been in the jostling crowd, they will be furious with her. She does not belong. One can guess that her intent was to slip in to get her healing, and then now that she's got it, she's going to slip out fast and unnoticed. She doesn't want to draw attention to herself because of the stigma that she carries. Verse 32, but Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear. Now, trembling with fear is a big deal here. This woman had guts. She had guts on steroids because fear and trembling in the book of Mark is code. And it's code for saying, I get that this is the Messiah. So when she's asked to identify herself, she steps up knowing that she will have been perceived to have violated the one who will redeem us all. With what I can only imagine was a trembling hand, she dares to step into the spotlight, certainly expecting trouble from the crowd. When I grow up, I want to be as brave as Faith is. This is my favorite moment in the whole story, even more than the miracle of her physical healing. Jesus does not let her slip away with just physical healing. Physical healing alone would be setting the bar far too low. The loneliness and isolation that was her life, Jesus wants that healed too. So she steps up. Faith steps in. Faith actively participates in. She co-creates her healing by partnering with Jesus in this moment. Jesus pulls off another layer of healing that cannot be ignored. As we are called to love like Jesus does, we got to pay attention to this. Jesus looks around to pull her into the group. He seeks to give her his time and public acknowledgement. He validates her touch in a crowd that wants him to hate her. He is willing to acknowledge that he was touched. And in so doing, in that culture, is to appear to bring shame upon himself by admitting that he was touched by an unclean woman. This is just crazy wonderful. Jesus is willing to risk being shamed by the crowd to let them all know that he accepts her. And then it says, trembling with fear, she tells him the whole truth. The whole truth, the whole story. The story, people, is 12 years long. And Jesus listens to it in front of this crowd. He gives her a voice. Jesus shows everyone that her story is important, that she is important. He co-regulates her as she's shaking like a leaf. He listens and he understands all the while the crowd is watching, perhaps dumbstruck that he isn't kicking her back up to the hills. He draws her in and shows compassion. He helps her feel better with the experience of being loved and cared for. And what makes this an even bigger deal is that this story is sandwiched in the middle of the story of Jarius, who's a very important official. Jarius has a deathly ill daughter, and he is desperate with a capital D to have Jesus come heal his daughter. Right after this story, they get to the daughter, and she has passed. Faith's story is right in the middle. Can you imagine what a big deal this is for Jesus to tell a frantic VIP to cool his jets while he hears this story from someone who has no business even being there? Jesus gives this woman a place back in her community. So verse 34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." In the Message, it says, Jesus said to her, "Daughter, you took a risk of faith. You took a risk, and now you're healed and whole. Live well, live blessed. Be healed of your plague." He calls her daughter here. This is the only time in the book of Mark he uses this term, intimate term, that implies family. Another cue to the crowd. This woman who you don't think you don't think she belongs, she's like family. And the word wholeness in the Greek is the word irene, which is the only time that Jesus uses this in the book of Mark. It implies a peace and a wholeness at every level. This healing was about so much more than physical healing. It was a political and cultural statement that brought Faith back into community and created a place for her in it. Faith could now hang out with friends, go to market, live with community. She got her life back. So there are three angles that are vital here. I'm going to cover the first two relatively quickly. First, Jesus and the crowd. Jesus, he looked beyond physical healing to see that so much more was needed. He brought her in from the outside to the center of the circle. He co-regulated her while he did it. He gave her a time in after everyone had given her a time out, lasting for years. He invited her out of isolation into a space where her nervous system didn't have to freak out from being alone. Secondly, the crowd. Jesus showed them that rules were less important than people. Love over law, connection over isolation. Jesus invites the crowd to get over themselves and include her. And Paul's going to have lots more to say about this next week as he focuses on the church's role in creating community. And I'm going to let him expand on this critical idea next week in a way that really highlights and closes off this series. He's going to give it the full spotlight that it deserves. So for the rest of this morning, we're going to look at faith in this story. The inclusion of her back into her community was a partnership between the community and faith. And Jesus made the arrangements. Please know that I believe it's an unreasonable expectation for anybody ever to be solely responsible for their own loneliness. This isn't putting it all on her, but it is looking at her important role. So I'm going to look at how she was a bravely active participant in her own social healing. But I am going to try to do it gently. Frankly, having been lonely at different times in my life, this is a part of the story that I'd rather not know. Here's the thing. Faith collaborated with Jesus in her healing. Very humanly, as a rather shy person myself, I wish the story was different. I wish that the story went like this. Jesus went up into the hills and healed Faith without her ever having to leave her safe place. Jesus went ahead of her and told everyone to be good to her so that when she showed up, all the work was done and everybody welcomed her with open arms. Wouldn't that version just be so much more convenient for all of us, and I include myself here, who don't really like to stick their necks out? Actively reaching out to others while in the position of loneliness is risky business. It is not for the faint of heart. Faith has wrecked my life. She has wrecked it because she doesn't let me sit and complain in a posture of self-pity like I would sometimes like to. Faith, along with my clients, they come in with struggles of abuse, trauma, abandonment, rejection, mental health issues, and pain upon pain upon pain. They come to therapy to do the hard work of healing. In fits and starts, they risk conversations, they apply for the job, they join the book club, they start the medication, they ask the hard questions of themselves and others. They engage in the active work of connecting with others. These brave clients and my buddy Faith, they compel me to do the same. To know these people and to live a life of integrity means that I use their bravery to inspire mine. I can't imagine the courage that Faith must have had to go towards Jesus, because it's really especially hard to step out during periods of loneliness. Here's the thing about loneliness. It's a trickster. Loneliness is a liar. A lonely person feels alone, and then their brain tries to make sense of it, without consulting anyone else, of course, because loneliness. Why am I so alone? Why do other people have friends, partners, places to go, places they feel like they belong, and I don't? And the temptation is for lonely people to connect the dots the way we as humans generally fill in dots, which is with shame. That feeling of, I'm not enough. I say this a lot. Shame is that feeling or belief that we are unworthy of love and belonging. 3 things about shame is we all have it. Everyone capable of empathy struggles with shame. No one likes to talk about this feeling, but the more we talk about it, the less control it has over us, which is why I talk about it a lot. When you're alone, you don't really tell anyone. And you don't really hear others struggle with it either, because they're not telling anyone either. So you feel really alone in your loneliness. It's easy for folks when they are lonely, and I count myself as having been very lonely in times of my life, to tell themselves that it is because there is something wrong with them. I have heard my own thoughts say, people don't want to be around me because they don't like me. There's no point in trying to connect because no one is going to want to be with me. If people wanted to be with me, I wouldn't be lonely in the first place. So I'm just going to be disappointed and even lonelier if I try and fail. So why try? Loneliness leads to conspiracy theories about our own lovability, which leads to a person to pull away and stay away, which leads to more loneliness, and now you've got a cycle where it spins tighter. Brene Brown writes this: stop walking through the world looking for confirmation that you don't belong. You will always find it because you've made that your mission. Stop scouring people's faces for evidence that you're enough. You will always find that because you've made that your goal. True belonging and self-worth are not goods. We do not negotiate their value with the world. The truth about who we are lives in our hearts. No one belongs here more than you. And that's what I love about Faith and her relationship with Jesus. She expected rejection from the crowd, and yet she showed up. She would have expected to hear, "You're not welcome." But Jesus said, "Come, tell me your whole story." She would wait to hear, "Get out of here, you're broken." Jesus said, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Faith would have expected some version of, "Get back into your isolated box of loneliness." And Jesus said, "Go and be freed." I'm convinced that Faith could only have done this because she had heard about Jesus and who he was. Faith had enough faith to connect. She trusted Jesus' love for her, so that no matter the outcome with the crowd, she could rely on his goodness and his love. Jesus is the encourager, the great co-regulator for Faith. Jesus' love didn't make it easy for her, but just barely doable, I think. Jesus promised his people that when he left, he would leave us the Spirit to collaborate with us. The Holy Spirit longs to empower us to take that step by co-regulating just enough to make it possible to walk out that door and into relationship. Faith's faith inspires me to take risks of connection. When the Spirit co-regulates me, I'm in a better place to cross the room and extend connection to another. Oh, you can bet that I'll still hesitate and be reluctant and feel the fear, but perhaps it will just be barely doable, and maybe on some days more than others. Jesus is known as the great physician. In the gospel, he prescribes healing connection to be with others. I'm going to close this morning with a story of a physician named Dr. Sam Everington. He did something called social prescribing, which is becoming more common now. Listen to Johann Hari, the same journalist that we heard at the beginning of the series now, and he's going to tell us a story about Dr. Sam. Please.
So Sam was a general practitioner in East London, a poor part of East London where I lived for a long time. And Sam was really uncomfortable because he had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he thinks there's some role for chemical antidepressants, but he could also see most of the people he was giving them to did become depressed again. And he could see that they were depressed and anxious for perfectly understandable reasons, right? Like, to give one of the examples I talk about in the book, loneliness. So he decided to pioneer a different approach. One day a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who'd been shut away in her home with dreadful depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, "Don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs. I'm also going to suggest something else." There was an area behind the suite of doctors' offices that was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it was like, just kind of scrubland. Sam said to Lisa, "What I'd like you to come and do is turn out a few times a week. I'm going to come too because I've been pretty anxious. We're going to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people. We're going to find something to do together as a group," right? The first time the group met, Lisa was literally physically sick with anxiety. But the group starts talking, they're like, "What can we do?" These are inner city East London people. They don't know anything about gardening. They decided they were going to teach themselves gardening, right? Going to turn Dog Shit Alley into a beautiful garden. So they start to watch YouTube. They start to read books. They start to get their fingers in the soil. They start to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to the natural world is a really powerful antidepressant. They start to do something even more important. They started to form a tribe. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one person didn't turn up, they'd go and look for them. They'd see if they were okay. They did what human beings do when we're part of tribes. They started to solve each other's problems. The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom.
I love that. As the garden they created together bloomed, so did they. But it started by Lisa Cunningham showing up terrified. She puked on the way to her social healing. Moving out of loneliness seems to involve being both scared and brave at the same time. The ironic thing about loneliness is that although we feel alone, we were and are never actually alone. The Spirit that indwells in us has the same love for us as Jesus had for faith. The Spirit encourages and supports and co-creates. The Spirit, in the Bible, the word for spirit is the same as breath. He invites us to breathe deeply as we make the terrifying but worthwhile risk into community. Amen.
Finally responded. So we'll start by Carolyn. I appreciate your enthusiasm for this text this morning. You've taught on this text before, and I'm always grateful that you spent much time with Faith to help us understand her courageous faith. Question. In your study of Mark 5, with these two stories unfolding intertwined, have you discovered any significance to the parallel of the woman bleeding for 12 years and the daughter of Jarius being 12 years old?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
There is a lot of parallels between those two stories. Mm-hmm. And so when Mark does this, it's this huge, beautiful literary device, which is called Mark and Sandwich. But Mark didn't invent the Mark, like the sandwich where you have like something in the middle, a story on either side. There's several of those in the book of Mark, but it's repeated in different literature of the time. And what's really cool about this is that the middle story is the lesson for the outside story. And so the kernel is in the middle, like it's like the meat in the sandwich is the good stuff. And what is remarkable about this Mark and Sandwich is that a woman that's unclean from the hills who's despised gives the lesson for this really important official on the outside. And so there's a wonderful commentary about sort of the upside down kingdom where Jesus invites us to learn from people who often are dismissed and not seen. Yeah. And Jesus brings her into the center of the sandwich, literally, to say to the official, look, everybody, look to see how we all can learn from somebody that historically would be dismissed otherwise in our culture. We're going to pay extra attention to her. And the person that normally is the one that gives us all the lessons, he is going to be the one that's going to learn from her. It's really cool that this is done. And once you understand that whole literary device, there's this whole other level at which you realize Jesus comes to upend social structures and make sure that those that aren't often seen or valued, that those are the ones that he's bringing into the center.
Okay, wow, thank you. Well said. Okay, questions, and more questions are coming in now, so let's get straight to it. The next question is, there's a comment first. The courage of faith is admirable. If only many of us could be so brave as to tell the whole truth and ask for help when we too are feeling lonely, ostracized, and at the end of the rope. How do we take that first step? And there's a few of those first step questions or practical ways.
Well, and I think that's the really key part of it, is that once you get co-regulated by somebody, it's easier to take the second, third, and fourth step. That first step is really, really hard. And she figured out how to do it, right? Which is the amazing part. And so I think That's where recognizing the presence of the Holy Spirit in us is that we co-regulate, and we, like, who am I as a child of God? Like, let me remember my value. Let me remember that when I try something and I don't, an outcome is uncertain, my value does not depend on that because I know who I am as a child of God. And as we are able to hold on to that identity and connect with the Spirit for that identity, that first step is so not easy, but maybe just barely possible. And even if it's just half a step, right? And asking for help is incredibly vulnerable. But I'd like you to just think about how much we all like when somebody asks us for our help. We like to fill a need, right? And so if you can remember that mostly people are wanting to be there and to create community, and that even though it's a risk, the risk is probably not as big as that conspiracy, that cycle of loneliness that spins tighter and tighter in your head. It's not as scary as what your brain tells you it is.
Okay. And then on to the next one. I think this probably will be your last one because of time. Love the law. This is beautiful. This is a beautiful concept. But for those of us, may I say, especially in the church, who are so used to living with boundaries and rules, it feels terrifying and there is so much risk. How do those of us who feel bound by the law reach out like Faith did, especially, like you pointed out, when we are struggling with shame?
This is something that the church has struggled with for 2,000 years, and I suspect will continue to struggle with, is that although God puts boundaries into place to help us live better lives, that love triumphs laws, and that we have to figure out how to have love triumph always, that we all learn to love each other and figure out how to, oh man, am I making any sense, right? Like, it's hard, it's really hard, and I think we have to wrestle and struggle with how do we love better, and where are we letting law get in the way of love, because that's not okay. We do that at a corporate level, and then we do that inside of ourselves when we edit ourselves to say, oh, I don't think somebody would like me if they knew this about me. We have to figure out how to have people be all of who they are in church.
All right. Okay, so I'll start with one which was kind of like asked as well, like in the first service. So a little bit similar. It says, what does TMP do to try to make sure their people aren't feeling lonely and isolated in their journey?
Well, I think it's a major project of TMP to have people feel welcome, that everybody feels like there's a place set at the table for them here. I know that our ushers and our welcome team work really deliberately to make sure that people feel welcome here. We have home groups where people are, if they're trying to get plugged in, you let Pastor Bob Fewings know, and he plugs a person in, and a smaller group of people, because Sunday morning, I know there's not a lot of people here today, but Sunday morning can be intimidating, and so to meet with 8 or 10 people in a home often is a good way to get to know people. And what we want to really do is partner with you to have you feel like this is a place where you belong. We have a great team here that works hard at that.
I agree. And you say all are welcome at the table. And I think this kind of like is a great segue into the next question that I have, because somebody out there is feeling like they don't have a seat at the table and they've been given a forced timeout. So this person says, as a trans person, am I welcome to be included in the crowd? Or am I in a forced timeout for all time? Is TMP brave enough to acknowledge that I'm part of this community and my isolation, even though others may think I will make them unclean for being there?
I just have tears at the back of my eyes. That question has such pain in it, and I also hear the courage in it. So the very short and very clear answer is yes, you are welcome here. Please come. I'll add a little bit to that. First of all, for the rest of us, I want you to hear the pain in that question and the plea in that question. And let's make sure that that person feels like uber welcome here, because it's likely that person has looked around and has felt judgment in a lot of places.
Yeah.
And let's have them, when they come here, feel the open arms of this community. But let me also speak to the very brave person who asked that question and have you know that although we seek to welcome you with open arms, we are also broken and damaged, and we are going to love you, but probably poorly. And so can you teach us when we blow it? Because we are learning and we want to do it better. And so please come, but please know that we are going to work to include you in a way that means that we are going to be having to do some learning too, and we want to do that learning. So please be patient with us.
Well said.
Thank you.
Said. Thank you. And then the last question is that, hi, Carolyn. I have a question about your concept of time in. In my line of work, I see a lot of children who have tantrums, behaviors, older kids with anxiety, and some with suicidal thoughts. A lot of these are in the realm of attention seeking. We try to regulate with redirection, but worry that giving time and attention to the behavior can give positive reinforcement. Can you clarify further what you mean by time in?
So time in, a lot of people are worried that if we say time in, that that's the same as permissiveness and children can get away with anything and that we reward bad behavior. Yeah. It's not the same. It's about saying, I was watching a video yesterday where they're saying if a child's having a tantrum not wanting to get out of the tub, there's this, would you like to get out of the tub by yourself or would you like me to help you? But the child gets out of the tub when the parent needs to, but you take a deep breath and you regulate yourself before you do that so that when your child is losing it, you're not also losing it, right? Like I think that's where having two caregivers is really helpful because any parent loses it sometimes. And I know as a single parent, that was always the moment of, what do I do? Because I'm losing it and I can't be calm for my child. So with children that are broken and wounded and struggling and attention seeking, it's hard to figure out how to do that. But the problem is that once children have a place where they feel love and secure, then they don't attention seek anymore. That attention seeking is saying, I need somebody else to regulate. And the challenge is for a person to say, you can, the ultimate was always when one child of mine was pulling the other child's hair, the child that's pulling the hair is dysregulated, but the child whose hair has just been pulled needs care and there's only one of me, right? And so the challenge is, how do you say to the child who's dysregulated and has just hurt somebody, you stay right here, I'll be with you in a minute, you matter to me, and I'm going to deal with the child who's hurt. It's a difficult balance to juggle when you have to figure out how to be there for somebody who's asking for something in a way that's not good, but you want to give them what they need in order to be able to calm down, talk about it, and figure out how to do it better. Good question, and indicating how hard it is to do that.
Thank you so much for how you've led us today with so much passion, love, and care, and it just comes across, and I'm sure a lot of us have been blessed today. I would like, please go ahead and send us off.
Thanks,
with
Steve.
the closing.
So, those of you who are at home who got stuck in your driveway and decided not to make the trip out, know that if you come next week, it's going to be warm in here. It's like, isn't it beautiful in here? We're so grateful that the heaters are now heating this place. If you would like prayer after the service, know that there will be people up at the front that would like to pray with you or for you. I'm going to close with 2 Corinthians 13, verse 11 to 13. I'm reading from the Message. The writer says, and that's about it, friends. Be cheerful. Keep things in good repair. Keep spirits up. Think in harmony. Be agreeable. Do all that, and the God of love and peace will be with you for sure. Greet one another with a holy embrace. All the brothers and sisters here, say hello. The amazing grace of Jesus Christ, the extravagant love of God, the intimate friendship of the Holy Spirit be with all of you. Amen.